CAAL-CBPA represents member libraries across the region, all of whom sit on the unceded and traditional territories of First Peoples. In Newfoundland and Labrador, our libraries sit on the homelands of the Inuit, of Nunatsiavut and Nunatkavut, the Innu of Nitassinan and Bealtook, and the Mi'kmaq peoples. In Prince Edward Island in Nova Scotia, we find our friends and colleagues situated on the territory of the Mi'kmaq. In New Brunswick, libraries are found on the land of the Wustuk, Mi'kmaq, and Passamaquoddy peoples. We at CAAL-CBPA wish to express our sincerest gratitude to the First Peoples who share their ancestral homelands with us all. Thank you, everybody. And just to give you a heads up in terms of protocol, so our first speaker is actually going to be live in the room. Because of the camera situation, she will be sort of in this area. Unfortunately, she can't wander because we have to use this camera because that one isn't really working very well. So just in case you're wondering why she's still here behind the mic. So first, let me welcome everybody, and I'm going to welcome our first speaker. Our first speaker is Amina Abawajy, and she is the Education Advisor and Human Rights and Equity Services here at Dalhousie University. She is going to be leading us in an hour-and-a-half sort of a workshop format. So that's going to require some interaction and participation on your part as well. But in the meantime, I'm going to turn this over to Amina, and her presentation is on the screen, and it is Cultivating an Inclusive Environment in the Libraries. Thank you very much, Amina.
Hello, everyone. And I think I'm in the camera lens. Is that good? Can you see me? Perfect. All right. So as was mentioned, my name is Amina Abawajy. I use she and her pronouns, and I'm the Education Advisor with the Human Rights and Equity Services.
Lorena is now joining.
Okay. So my role includes doing workshops, personal development, professional development, trainings, etc., in the realms of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I'm excited today to talk about cultivating an inclusive environment in the libraries. So I always start my workshops with a territory acknowledgement, and I really appreciated hearing a territory acknowledgement at the opening of this forum. So Dalhousie University sits on the ancestral, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people, and as Peace and Friendship Treaty beneficiaries. Are folks familiar with the Peace and Friendship Treaties? Lots of nods, some no's. So the Peace and Friendship Treaties are treaties that govern Mi'kmaq. So Mi'kmaq spans Nova Scotia, parts of New Brunswick, parts of Newfoundland, parts of Quebec, parts of Maine. And the Peace and Friendship Treaties outline our responsibilities as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to each other, but also to this land. And the reason that we say that this land is unceded and unsurrendered is because the land was never given up to the Crown. So the relationship was one of peace and friendship, so to work alongside each other in this territory in peace and in friendship. And so this treaty is also upheld in our Constitution, so it is a working document. It is something that we all should read, should understand, and to really recognize a responsibility to continuously educate ourselves and to work in solidarity with Mi'kmaq and other Indigenous communities across Turtle Island, because we are all treaty people. And when we're talking about creating inclusive environments, it's really important to recognize our histories of inclusion and exclusion. And in this region in particular, I want to also highlight the founding communities of the African Nova Scotian communities, as well as the Acadian communities, in really building this territory as we know it today. So I have some community agreements, and community agreements essentially are what we need to bring ourselves fully into this session. Some of these topics may land differently for different folks based on your experiences and your lived realities. And so I have a few listed here. And if folks have any more, we can definitely add to this list. So respectful communication and speech, try to understand different perspectives, empower others, maintain confidentiality. And so this one, where it is a sort of recorded speech, sort of understanding our limits to confidentiality is important. But also practicing self-care. So whenever I do these workshops, I always maintain an open door policy. So the doors aren't physically open, but feel free to come and go as you need to, whether that's to the bathroom, to get a drink of water, whatever it may be. Are there any other items that we might want to add to this list? Okay. And this is open. We can come back to it whenever we need to. So our goal for today is to foster an understanding of some key terms, concepts, and definitions related to equity, diversity, and inclusion, to really establish and understand the right to a working and learning environment free from discrimination and harassment, and recognizing that that is a shared responsibility amongst all of us. And then we'll explore some options to fostering inclusive workplaces. So were folks at the session where we did it with the Killam Library? Are there quite a lot of folks from there? Some folks? Okay. So there is a lot of material that might be familiar, but there's also some new material, and so hopefully it'll be a different experience this time around. So to give you a little bit of information about the Human Rights and Equity Services, so we are a service of Dalhousie University. We're located on the Studley campus on the 4th floor of the McDonald building. And we work in the areas of human right, discrimination, accommodation, sexualized violence, personal harassment, conflict, as well as education.
Is now joining.
And so we have a number of different advisors in our office that deal with different policies and areas, as well as an intake coordinator, so someone who sort of navigates our office and the policies. So if you do have any questions related to any of these different areas, please feel free to get in touch. And our contact information is at the end of this slide deck. So to get us going, I do have an activity to start us off. It's called a social location activity. You will need a piece of paper and a writing utensil. And I'm going to ask folks to draw a x-axis and a y-axis, or if you're more sort of visual or food inclined, thinking of cutting a pizza into 4 slices. So I have a list of about 28 statements that I'm going to read out. So starting at the x-axis, or the 12 o'clock, and moving clockwise. It looks counterclockwise because I'm facing you, but moving clockwise, as I read out each statement, if the statement strongly relates to you, I want you to put a dot closer to the center of this diagram. If you feel that the statement doesn't relate to you, it'll be sort of on the outer part of the diagram. And if it somewhat relates to you, it'll be somewhere on that tangent. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions? Okay. So the first statement is, I have attended a post-secondary institution. So if you have gone to college or university, many of you are in this space, so I assume that your dot should be closer to the center of the diagram. Okay. Yes. 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 You can, no, it's totally fine. You can start just right on that line and then move towards the next line, if that makes sense. So you're going to have about 7 in each quadrant. Yes. So if you want to start at the line and end at the line and have 5 in between, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. That motion. Yes.
No, sorry, basically, they just want to repeat the question that folks were asking.
Okay. Essentially, the question was, are we starting at noon was one of the questions, so along the x-axis. And the other question was whether we would place the dots on the lines or in between the lines. And it's sort of a combination. So you would start at the top line and move throughout the diagram.
Is now exiting.
Yeah, or if it's a maybe, it would be somewhere on that diagram, on that line. Yeah. A post-secondary.
We're all visual.
Okay, ready for the second statement? I have had access to more than 50 books growing up, and these are purchased books, not through the library. I identify comfortably with the gender I was assigned to at birth. This one is usually one that I ask with students, and so it might not be relevant. Feel free to skip. But my parents are still together and live in the same home, or were still together and lived in the same home. My parents had a university education. English is my first language. I am right-handed.
So that's 7, so we move to the next one.
Mhm.
Okay.
I can find Band-Aids at most stores that match my skin tone. Who knew that bandages were meant to match your skin tone? I have no trouble finding appropriate hair products. Public transportation is not my only form of transportation. So if you have access to a vehicle or a regular ride, your dot would be closer to the center of the diagram. And this might not be applicable for everyone, so again, feel free to skip. But I have no problem finding beauty products that work with my skin tone. I can access healthy and culturally appropriate food at most grocery stores. I come from an English-only speaking household. I feel as though my identity, and it can be any part of your identity, is well represented in the institution. Yes. I can fit into most clothing stores' generic size range. I consider myself to be able-bodied. I consider myself to be neurotypical. Neurotypical, so not facing any sort of mental health challenges or struggles. I have never been asked if I am really from here. I feel comfortable showing romantic affection towards my partner in public without fear of ridicule or repercussion. I feel comfortable calling the police or security if I am in trouble or in need of their services. I have accepted something, so that could be a scholarship, a job opportunity, etc., based on my association with a friend or family member. So if you've had access to an opportunity based on a connection you had. I feel comfortable making mistakes without folks attributing them to my identity. I always feel comfortable walking home alone at night. I have access to a community that I feel represented in. I have studied the culture of my ancestors in elementary school and feel as though it was an accurate representation of our history. I have never been made fun of or bullied for something that was beyond my control or I could not change. I have never missed a bill payment due to insufficient funds. I believe this is the last one. I have never been catcalled. Do folks know what catcalled is? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to connect the dots. So the purpose of the social location activity is really to help us think through some of these concepts such as privilege, power, access in a way that is personal and perhaps we haven't thought of before. So were there any statements that made you think in a way that you haven't thought of outside of this activity? Hmm. Yeah. For a lot of folks, it's a reality that, every time that you're going to your car or just trying to do something that you are being catcalled, while for other folks, that's not something that they have to even consider at all, right? And so privilege really is those things that we don't even have to think about because we don't experience them. Yeah, so that one is very interesting for sure. Are there other things that stuck out for folks? I don't know if folks online are pretty quiet. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Even for me, like before this activity, I had no idea. The Band-Aid was just a Band-Aid. Did you say there was someone online?
No, they were asking what was happening.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Were there any statements that you felt were missing? Anything you thought that maybe should have been highlighted in this exercise related to power or privilege? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Yes, for sure. Yeah. And are bicycles considered public transportation? Are they considered? Yeah. Mhm. Right. Definitely. Yeah. And that is one that I would probably put somewhere in the middle of the diagram. Mm-hmm. Sorry. Nice. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're going to go through a few different concepts. And I have a quote here by Verna Myers, who's a Black legal scholar. And she talks about diversity and inclusion in this way. She says, diversity is being invited to the party, while inclusion is being asked to dance. And so when you look at your webs or the diagrams that you've created, if you look to your left and your right, you'll notice that these diagrams are different. All of us are diverse. We hold different life stories. We come from different walks of life, which is great. It's great that we're all here and that we're all different and diverse. But inclusion is really that active step that we all take to ensuring that everyone feels like they belong. So diversity is being invited to the party. So yes, we're all here, but inclusion is being asked to dance. And so throughout this workshop and throughout sort of your afternoon, I really hope that folks can really think about what are those active steps that we're all taking to ensure that everyone feels like they belong. So have folks seen this diagram before? Lots of nods, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. So this diagram helps us think through our concepts of equality, equity, and really looking at the barriers of a situation. So on our first image to my right, everyone is standing on one box. So everyone is being treated equally, everyone is being treated fairly. But you see that one person has no vantage of the game, while one person can see the game pretty well. When we go to our next image, we see that one person has no boxes to stand on, while another person has 2 boxes to stand on, but now everyone has equal opportunity to accessing the game. And so this is our concept of equity. And when we move one step further, this image is really asking us to think about what are those systemic barriers and how can we remove them altogether. And so a lot of the work that we do in our realm is through this equity lens, because we live in a society where we still need to be correcting historic disadvantages. A lot of our approaches to this work is through an equitable lens. And I think what we're working towards is really looking at what are those barriers and how we can remove them altogether, but that's something that we're currently working towards. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about this diagram? Okay. So microaggressions. Have folks heard of microaggressions before? Some nods. So I have a definition here and then a short video to help illustrate the concept of microaggressions. So microaggressions are brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental actions, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults towards members of oppressed or targeted groups. So quite a mouthful, but we're gonna watch this video that'll help break it down. There is a little bit of language in this video, so I just wanted to give folks a heads up.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
Oh, you're so well spoken.
just imagine instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and our itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while,
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland.
sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, sure, he was so good.
excuse me, going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins' name. Part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
John, shopping so here
I'm
too.
getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day.
Touch your hair.
Multiple times.
mosquito bite. Who cares? Some bigger black one.
Just being this can be truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life. There's astrophysics. Maybe you should this challenging major. This can be smart. I can do. It's got it. Wow.
So what did folks think about that video? Yeah, I think it does a really good job of capturing sort of a broad topic in a very succinct and relatable way. Were some of these microaggressions familiar to folks? Have folks heard some of them? I see a lot of nods. Were there other microaggressions that folks have heard that weren't shared in this video? I can share one, and then maybe folks can think about it and share one. So a story that I like to share a lot, and something that really sticks out to me with this definition, is that it can be intentional or unintentional. And oftentimes microaggressions are unintentional. They're often, they seem pleasant. They can be, you know, if you look at sort of the surface level, it can be a very pleasant exchange. But it's sometimes sort of these deeper hidden meanings that make it a microaggression. And it really is about the impact, right? So one person could react very differently to a situation than another person. And so the story that I like to share is that I have been welcomed to Canada on multiple occasions. And so as someone who was born and raised here, that lands very differently for me than, for example, my mother, who, when she's welcomed to Canada, it's a very pleasant exchange. It's an opportunity for her to talk about her culture and her history and her family. And that is a completely different sort of impact than when that very same question is asked to me, again, as someone who's born and raised here. So for me, it says, you know, you look like you don't belong here. You look like you couldn't possibly be from here. So where are you from? So again, it really is something that on the surface, right, welcome to Canada seems very pleasant, but it's those sort of deeper connotations that have an impact on the individual. Yeah, so with that, was there anyone who wanted to share a microaggression that they perhaps heard of? It doesn't, yeah.
Being on a bus, having the first sort of slide and maybe he's got to take off on a thing, reaching for it first. It's kind of, you know, an expectation. I don't know, but that's, you know.
Yeah.
Gone to that realm.
And
subconsciously, like, I mean, some part of my brain did it, not even realized it.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of these things are really subconscious. And we're going to talk a little bit about implicit bias and how that affects us. But it really is these sort of things that happen that could have some sort of subliminal messaging or impact to the other person that we might not intend, but the impact might be there, right? And so another one that is sort of related that I hear a lot is folks crossing the street when there is a male or a Black male that is sort of on that side. So feeling more comfortable on the other side of the street, for example. So definitely a very common microaggression, and thank you for sharing. Yeah. Anyone else?
Speaking of that, I do get that because I walk my dog all the time. And sometimes I do see people cross the street. You know, sometimes you wonder, you know, why they're, you know, going the other way if they're right behind you. Next thing you know, they're across the street. So I do get that sometimes.
Yeah, and that doesn't feel very great as someone who, you know, is just out walking your dog or whatever the case may be. Like that impact is very real. And microaggressions, as the definitions say, they are very commonplace. They happen so often, and it can be, as, I don't want to say simple, but as simple as, hearing a joke and laughing at it or allowing that joke in that space, right? So that communicates to a group or individuals within that group that this is allowed in the spaces that you are a part of. And so microaggressions, again, they're very commonplace, they're very insidious, and it is something that we have to really question sort of all of our interactions to get to sort of the root of. But there are a lot of common microaggressions. And so sort of learning and educating ourselves on what those are and trying to stay away from them, I think is a starting point. So I'm going to talk a little bit about personal harassment. So personal harassment is conduct that is abusive, unfair, or demeaning treatment of a person or group of persons that is known or ought reasonably to be known to be unwelcome and unwanted. And personal harassment is often a persistent or a pattern of behavior. So some typical examples include repeated incidences of name calling, insults, threats, abusive language, or shouting. It could be through the spreading of malicious rumors, rude behavior that is persistent or pervasive. It could even be constantly critiquing another person's work, or additional and unnecessary workload. So if you're always sort of carrying the brunt of a certain type of workload in an office, that could be personal harassment. So we're going to switch gears to biases. Have folks seen this video before? Some nods. So it is a snippet of a TED Talk that was done by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, who is a wonderful speaker and author. So I'm going to let her speak through her own words.
It was shocked by me. She asked when I left to speak English so well. I'm confused by the English as its official language. She asked what she called music. So I produced my table. To use a stove. She saw me. Had position to as an African. What kind of story of Africa? Of catastrophe. Possibility of Africans. That's a complex and pity. Possibility of connection as people. African. But people about places like that. But African. To Africa is referred to as a country. All like from 2 days ago, which the like about the Chinese, Africa and other countries. African to me. Up in Nigeria, Africa, which is I would think beautiful, it's beautiful people of poverty and AIDS speak for themselves.
Lorena
is now exiting.
Mexico from the US. The political situation at the time was tense and about immigration. What happened immigration begins with Mexicans. There Mexicans as people who were across the border, step at the border, that sort of thing. I think that state of Guadalajara, watching the people into work, up to the in the marketplace, speaking, laughing. Surprised. To Mexicans and the abject ignorance. I wanted to think of the Mexicans, I couldn't be ashamed of myself. So this is the truth of the story. People as working, and that is what they become. We talk about power. I think about the power structures of the world. It's a that literally translates to be greater than another. Like our political still defined by the principle of capital, who tells them, told, told, dependent on power. Power is just to tell the story of another person, but to make it to the definitive story of that person. If you want to dispossess the people, to the story and to start with differently. Of Native Americans to the British and have an entirely different story. Start the story with the fate of the African states and with the British region of the African states and have an entirely different story.
What did folks think of that video? Yeah, she's a really powerful speaker. And what I really like about this video is that she not only talks about when she was impacted by sort of biases and prejudice, but also when she participated in it. And a lot of the work that we do in terms of diversity, inclusion, is really interrogating our past, having those uncomfortable conversations with ourselves, and really looking at some of those truths that we might not want to or might be difficult to uncover. And so it's hard to point at yourself sort of and say, you know, this is what I did. But it's important to do that in order to grow and to move forward from that. And so naming and really interrogating our biases is one part of this difficult work and this difficult conversation. So I have another video here. And this is a video that launches into a conversation. Oh, it does pull up into a YouTube. Does that show up on the screen? Yep. Okay, perfect. Okay. See if I can play it from.
Share your business.
Okay.
Back and forth. Talk amongst yourselves. Okay. Stop sharing. Instead, I'm going to share the desktop. There we go. The desktop, there we go. So where were we in your slides?
Whoops, just right there.
Here?
Yep.
Okay. And then I'm going to, where did it open up? There we go. That's it. Let me just make sure it shows up.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. We'll give folks a minute. folks a minute to get back to their seats, maybe. Yeah. So we talked about sort of the unintentional, and so this kind of builds on that unintentional piece. So kind of working on those pieces that we might not even be aware that we're doing or that we're participating in or that we're even thinking about. So this is a cute little video that highlights that we don't know what we don't know. Yeah, we don't know what we don't know.
Is this text. It's right to make. The is the keen. But
It's hard to see on the screen here. It's easier to see on the screen.
Yeah, were folks able to see it a little bit? No? Maybe we can send out the slides after this, but it is a little bit easier to see on the screen. Perfect, and that's showing up okay, Cynthia?
Yeah.
Okay, great. This is an ad for cyclist awareness, but it also speaks to some of the work around biases. So you're not aware of some of the biases you hold until you do that work of interrogating your biases and really sort of focusing on them and working to minimize them. And so unconscious bias or implicit bias, as defined by the Kirwan Institute, is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. Unconscious biases can impact our perception, attitude, behaviors, attention, listening skills, and micro-affirmations. So by definition, we are not aware of our unconscious biases, but we know that they do have real world effects on our actions, our interactions, and our decisions. Have folks seen that sort of, it was circulating on social media, but there were two sets of resumes, identical resumes, but one set of resumes had English sounding names while another set of resumes had non-English sounding names. And so again, these were identical resumes sent to employers, and the ones with the English sounding names were picked up at a much, much higher rate. And so there has been a lot of studies that have been done in this area. And again, it is rooted in unconscious bias, but there are real world impacts and effects of those decisions. There have been studies done that show that our brain can trick us, for example, if we think that food is more expensive, we might think that it tastes better. So our brain will trick us into thinking that it tastes better. Or if we know a wine to be more expensive, our brain will trick us into thinking that it tastes better. Again, these are just ways that unconscious biases manifest. And so what we know about unconscious biases is that they develop at an early age and they emerge across childhood and develop across childhood. So it's really important to interrogate our past, our history, sort of our growing up worlds and what sort of we've carried into our future selves. Unconscious biases, as we said, have real world effects on behavior, but we also know that unconscious biases are malleable, so we can take steps to minimize the impacts of our unconscious bias. There are a number of different biases. If you give it a quick Wikipedia Google, I know Wikipedia is probably not a good good resource. But there are a number of different biases that affect us. And so I chose just to highlight 5 here, but definitely take a look. So there is affinity bias, which is the tendency to warm up to people who are like ourselves. The halo effect, which is the tendency to think everything about a person is good because you like that person. Perception bias is the tendency to form stereotypes and assumptions about certain groups that make it very difficult to make objective judgments about individual members of that group. Confirmation bias, as the name suggests, is to seek out information that confirms pre-existing beliefs or assumptions. And then groupthink is a bias that occurs when people try to fit into a certain group by mimicking others or holding back their own thoughts and opinions. And this allows organizations, or this causes organizations to lose out on creativity and innovation. Any questions on the different types of bias? Okay, I have a little bias exercise that I'm hoping we can do in teams, maybe in pairs or groups of 3, 2 to 3. So I have 3 things that I'm hoping you can discuss. One is a time that you were impacted by someone else's bias. The second, and this one's a little bit more difficult, is a time when you perpetuated bias. And then the third is a proactive measure you would like to implement, whether in your personal or professional life, to minimize or mitigate a bias that you hold. 3 things. And then if folks feel comfortable, we'll share with the larger group. Folks online, maybe an independent exercise for you. So does anyone feel comfortable sharing what they discussed for number 1? Anybody?
I will.
Okay.
It's Cynthia here in the room. We were talking about language and how we don't necessarily always think about the terms we use, the things we used growing up, like using the word guys when we're talking about everybody. But to other people, it may be interpreted as you're excluding me as a female. So it's more of being reflective and thinking about those terminologies we grew up with that may not be applicable outside of the region we grew up in. They may not be understood the same. Also, we were talking about when we're presenting, we may not be able to get somebody to look at our presentation in advance to see whether there might be terminology that we're using that could be interpreted in ways that may not be positive. But potentially asking after you give presentations to have people give you feedback about your use of the language and stuff just to help you improve for the next experience. We are a really quiet room today.
We talked about being in meetings as women where the idea is then attributed to a man. A woman might come up with the idea the first time, and then a man will follow up, and then other men in the room will pat him on the back and encourage him. And that happens a bit. I think women now have thought about that, and oftentimes, and I've been in meetings with deans where all of the deans now at Acadia are women, and they will circle back. Another dean will say, oh, yeah, to Laura's point originally, and they will circle back to give credit to who it's due.
I hear that one a lot. I don't know if folks have heard of the term mansplaining. So that's man explaining, sort of put together, but it sort of encapsulates this concept of when males sort of take credit for either a female or someone else's thoughts, ideas, and are sort of credited as the sole original creative person behind that. Very, very common. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you. I'll just add a related point that I think, at least in the world that I'm part of within the university. I think it's a hard bias to address because I think there's such a lack of awareness on the part of the people doing it that it's hard to call out because I think with some other types of bias, there is an awareness once it's pointed out to people that it's happened, but it's hard even with this one, which is so common, to even gain an awareness that it's how people are behaving. So it is particularly challenging, I think.
Definitely. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think that a lot of biases, but this one in particular, it is hard to name and to call out, especially if you're sort of on the receiving end of it, if it is sort of your comment that was sort of taken up by someone else. It can be really difficult to say, actually, that was my idea, right? But I like this idea of the other deans sort of circling back and putting that responsibility on sort of everyone in the room, right? This is a shared responsibility. So when you see something, how can other folks sort of step in and call it out so the person who's experiencing it is not always the person who is also then speaking about it? Yeah. What about for number 2? Okay, what if we say 2 or 3? Yeah.
I'd say I'm really guilty of the hateful bias. Because I like someone, they may say or actions may do things that are not really my core values, but I just like them so much that I've just kind of brushed that to the side. And really, moving into the next one, I think I probably should speak up when this person's making, bad jokes or what have you. But because I definitely realize it, but you kind of weigh the factor. I like them, and if I say something, is that going to change our relationship, sort of thing? So you tend to ignore it, but it's not a good thing at all.
Yeah, and I think the halo effect is really common, especially where we're sort of in a culture of like a celebrity culture where there are people that are sort of glorified, regardless of sort of what they do, they're still sort of up there, they're glorified. And we see that sort of ripple effect in our small pockets and small communities, right? When we like people, it's harder then to sort of point out sort of their mistakes, or we're easier to forgive them for those mistakes, right? So definitely I see halo effect a lot. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you all so much for taking part in this exercise and for participating. I think we'll move on. So I thought it might be helpful to share some definitions of an inclusive workplace and inclusive environment, since that's what we're talking about. So an inclusive workplace is a working environment that values the individual and group differences within its workforce. So an inclusive workplace make diverse and really all employees feel valued, welcome, integrated, and included in the workforce instead of isolated. An inclusive environment is in an inclusive environment, people of all orientations can freely express who they are, their own opinions and points of view, fully participate in teaching, learning, work, and social activities, and feel safe from abuse, harassment, or unfair criticism. Yeah.
The definition of inclusive environment focuses on cultural orientations. The inclusive workplace seems broader than that. And we were talking about some of the biases earlier. We talked about more biases than culture. And although culture is a super important one, I wonder if that's narrower than it needs to be for an environment to actually be inclusive.
I definitely agree. And I think when I was reading it out, I purposefully sort of skipped over the cultural because I think it is based on sort of all of the orientations or identities that folks hold. And so, yes, I think the inclusive workplace is a little bit more broader in this written definition. This is the inclusive environment definition was one specifically through sort of a cultural lens, but I think the definition does apply to all sort of identities that folks hold. Yeah. And I have this diagram that talks about the forms of oppression as individual and systemic, but I also want to add that our responses should be as well individual and systemic. And so I have a few scenarios after this, but really we want to think about what is our response sort of as person to person, but also what is our response as an institution, as a part of a team, as a part of sort of a larger framework. And so individual, as sort of the name connotates, is a person's beliefs and actions that serve to perpetuate oppression. So it could be individual, so it could be your own thoughts or actions, or that could also be interpersonal, so between individuals. On the other hand, we have institutional and structural, which are both systemic. So institutional is the policies and practices of an organization that perpetuate oppression. And structural is how these effects interact between or across institutions. So if we're thinking about sort of the academic institution and then perhaps the health and how those interact, so it is between institutions. So again, there are individual and systemic forms of oppression, and when we're responding to these, there should be individual and systemic responses as well. So I have a video here by Dr. Joy Rue, just a time check. So we have about 15 minutes. I think I'm going to skip this video and go to the scenarios, and then we'll come back and circle to the videos if we have time at the end. So I have a video on speaking up that I'm not going to play right now, as well as a video on practicing allyship. And we'll circle back to those two videos if we can. Meaningful apologies. Go to the scenarios. So I have 3 scenarios. I was going to see if we could break up the group, but we might just do it. We might just do it all together. So Shanice has been noticing a male hanging around her work area. She thinks his name is Mark and that he may be friends with one of her coworkers. After noticing him a few times at work, she starts running into him constantly. He was always hanging around outside of her lunchroom and showing up around her workplace and at all the events she attends with her friends. Shanice tries to ignore the coincidence until he adds her on Facebook and begins commenting on her photos. Through Facebook, he tracks down her phone number and begins texting her persistently. Shanice tries to be nice and asks him to stop, but he won't give up. Shanice begins feeling anxious and worried when she's at work and contacts you because she believes she's being stalked by Mark. So how would you respond individually, and how would you respond systemically?
In the scenario, is there a particular role that I am? Am I her supervisor, friend?
We're going to sort of role play. So sort of how would you respond if you were a coworker? How would you respond if you were the supervisor? Would that change? How would that be different? Mm-hmm. I think I saw a hand in the back.
I don't know how to deal with this at work, but in my own life, it happened with a friend, mutual friend. So 3 friends, me. He started texting the other friend, and then she asked me to talk to him and just tell him to stop being a creep. Mm-hmm. And he got pretty defensive when he was talking to me, but we've moved through it. But at first, it was pretty bad. But it's the sort of thing that I didn't even know he was doing, because guys in particular will hide stuff from other guys that they don't see. So she basically told me what to say to him and what not to say, because she didn't want to be outed to him as well. Mm-hmm. But in terms of a workplace, I have no idea where to start.
Yeah, and thank you for highlighting that this is sort of a common scenario. It does happen. Sometimes we sort of see these scenarios and we're like, whoa, That could never happen, but it does. So what would you do in a workplace as an individual? So Shanice has come to you sort of as a coworker. How would you respond in the moment?
More information you have about him if things went south really quick, like how did he originate there? How did he get there? And if you have some kind of connection that you know and find more out about him, if he is a threat or not. I would just see like how, maybe it was just random that he showed up there.
Great.
Maybe he does have a friend and could help you, as McLaughlin said, you know, be.
Yes, getting more information is definitely a route that can be taken.
There was also a comment online about suggesting she change some of her settings to block some people and not accepting, although they also preface that by saying we don't want to get into victim blaming, I guess.
Definitely.
So that was my response as a colleague and friend, some kind of digital literacy about, nobody knows that you've blocked them or removed them, but, kind of in that other setting is looking for strategies to allow them to be at work and, kind of put a little barrier so she has time to breathe when Mark is lurking about, to then move to talking to Mark and intervening.
And I think there was a hand in the front as well.
Speaking as a coworker, and I've been in a similar kind of situation, maybe a number of times in a different library than I work now. I think it's important to leave the agency with Shanice for what you do and what you don't do. So if she's speaking to you as a coworker, it's important to be supportive in the ways that she wants you to be supportive. But if she does not want like a full force system put in place, then it's important to not do that. And you could actually amplify her fear or inadvertently make her situation be more dangerous and escalate something. And so working with that, I think, is critical in this kind of situation.
I agree. I think in a lot of situations, it's really important to take the lead from the person who's been the most impacted in the situation, because there might be factors for consideration in terms of their safety, of sort of repercussions, things that can sort of follow if this were to move forward in a specific way that they didn't want. And so whenever possible, I think it's really important to follow the direction of the person who's been most impacted. So in this situation, if I was a coworker, I would start by thanking Shanice for sharing this experience with me. It can be difficult to talk about things that are happening, especially to a coworker or someone that you might not have, that sort of friend-to-friend relationship with. I would then, ask her, she believes that she might be being stalked by Mark. So I would perhaps point her to some resources that are on campus. So I would point her to our office, as we have a policy that deals with personal harassment. So perhaps this falls under it. Is there an advisor that you might want to speak to? Can I accompany you to that appointment? Is that something that you'd be interested in? So sort of offering resources and supports that Shanice can sort of take up and look at. But then also really addressing sort of that immediate safety concern, right? Are there any immediate safety concerns in the moment? Is this something that we need to let our supervisor know so that they're aware that this person shouldn't be coming to the office? And if that is something she wants to explore, I think that falls into sort of the systemic category, right? So getting a supervisor involved, looking at ways that we can prevent or be more proactive when it comes to situations like this. So perhaps it is, your office gets a little button under the desk. So when people sort of are here and there are people that shouldn't be here, someone is alerted. Perhaps it's having a list of people who cannot be in the office at the front desk. And so when people come in, if there are people who shouldn't be in, so thinking about ways that we can sort of be proactive in these kinds of situations would be a systemic response. Yeah.
There were just a couple comments online I wanted to pass on. So there was to listen to her and believe her, work with her to find supports as well as activate any policies on campus about behavior. And then individually to Shanice that she takes screenshots and keep track of unwanted communications, provide personal support and listen and follow up with her and support however she wants to communicate her issue with whoever is responsible for workplace safety.
Great, yeah, some really great points. Thank you. Yeah.
Too, that I'm picking up on the line that that Shanice has contacted us because she believes she's being stalked, and I do think that it's important that we understand the different, where there might potentially be a distinction between Shanice's comfort and our responsibility to maintain a safe workplace, depending what the nature of the stalking is. So I could imagine that there might be scenarios where our concern would perhaps extend to other people, or would our concern for Shanice's workplace safety could potentially be at odds with her preferences, and then how difficult it could be to have to make sure that we're putting into effect some of the practices that will protect her, recognizing that she might not be looking for those explicitly for the situations. Some of these situations can be really difficult to deal with when we know something that we're being asked not to act on, but it's a serious business. And so when that line is between our, sometimes there's a tension between the two, but we can be told something and then told, please don't do anything about it, when we know that actually something potentially should happen about it. So.
Definitely, and these situations are definitely nuanced, and stalking in particular is or can be criminal behavior, and so it is quite serious in nature, and there is this responsibility, especially on those in positions of power, to ensure that the workplace is safe, it is a conducive environment. And so when I talk about sort of following the direction of those who are most impacted, in most cases, it is sort of these cases where you're in that position of power that sometimes that might not be something that you can do. Another sort of example of that would be in sort of sexualized violence sort of area or a category. And so, for example, if you know that someone in a position of power is abusing their position of power, that is something that you may not necessarily be able to keep in a one-to-one sort of relationship. So it is something that you might not have to sort of escalate and share with your supervisor and or your department head, especially if that person is a minor, etc. So there is a responsibility or a duty to sometimes share that with other people, right? So there are some sort of limits to confidentiality, for sure. Okay, any other points on this scenario? So we're almost at the 1:30 mark, so I have two more scenarios here, but I think we might just have time for one more. Let's do this scenario here. So 2 years ago, Zelda, a fellow librarian, came out to your team as non-binary and has informed your team of their usage of they, them pronouns. Zelda informs you, their supervisor, that Chad, one of their coworkers, has consistently misgendered them. How would you respond individually, and how would you respond systemically?
Is this one where this has been communicated broadly to all the other staff in terms of what pronoun to use?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So as an individual, well, I guess I'm thinking more from a coworker's point of view, that something that could be offered or suggested is that either if they felt comfortable with it, that then we would go and have an individual conversation with the person who is consistently misgendering them, that it can either be a personal conversation, either between the supervisor and the person who is consistently misgendering, or it can be a conversation with all three. Or if it's, depending on if this is a library that has given training to the larger staff on this topic area. That could be a suggestion that it could be an opportunity to do a staff training situation around this topic. And I think that it would be best to kind of go with the flow of this individual, Zelda, and how they felt about how they would like their individual situation dealt with.
Anyone else want to? Yeah.
I was just wondering at Dal, like if there is a policy or procedure in place for when people are doing this, how you would approach an employee, or if you were an employee and saw it with someone else, how you would bring it up.
So there is a gender affirmation policy. It speaks more to sort of the supports, resources, so it gets to some of those pieces. And it is sort of being rolled out currently. So the implementation sort of part of it. So there is a policy. There are folks who can speak to like supports and resources. But I would say that's sort of the extent of it at Dal. So our office, so the Human Rights and Equity Services Office does deal with like, we do sort of do like an official complaint process as well as like informal sort of, if it was a discussion, that sort of thing, we could facilitate those. Does that answer your question or? Mm-hmm. So it would depend on sort of the situation and the extent of the situation. Most likely we would look to Zelda in terms of what outcome she would be hoping for. It could fall under the personal harassment, or sorry, the statement on prohibited discrimination. And so there isn't sort of, there aren't formal processes under that statement, but we could look, it could be sort of a number of things. It could be an official record, it could look at education. So it really depends on what the outcome Zelda is looking for. And then again, there's nuances to that.
Thank you. I wanted to add that as a supervisor, I think you have an obligation to advocate for policies that give you tools to deal with this, so that maybe it's your inclusive workplace policy or whatever policy it is, that you can point out to Chad that part of a respectful, inclusive workplace is using the pronouns someone needs to use. And if you don't use them, there are repercussions. So having something in place so Zelda's not doing all the heavy lifting seems to be one of the systemic things that would be important to do, I think.
Mm-hmm. Policies, whether institutional or within that sort of unit, definitely is a systemic approach, and either pointing to them or developing them if they don't exist, for sure. Yeah.
I think as a supervisor, you have to be sympathetic for both. I've dealt with a similar situation myself with a staff member, and it wasn't a colleague, it was a patron of the library. But I'd be very supportive of Zelda because this could be a microaggression for her. It's happening over and over again. Or him, they. But for Chad, part of the issue may be that for years they've worked with Zelda, and Zelda has been a she or a he, and now they're a they or a them. And they're really having a hard time internalizing that themselves. So when they see that person, they still see them in their old role. So you would need to, I wouldn't just take it as it's a disciplinary or they're doing it deliberately. They would need some support on how to change the way they're responding. So that might be some training for them. But obviously you have to get them to accept the new pronoun and to see them that way. But I think you have to show some support on both sides.
I definitely think that education is always a great systemic approach for the whole team, I think, as was mentioned before, but also for Chad, one thing with this scenario that really strikes me is that it's been 2 years. And so I think about what happened within those 2 years, right? Has there been educational opportunities? Have these discussions already happened? And are we at a point where, you know, enough is enough, right? That this is intentional and this is reoccurring and this is sort of stepping into other areas where, you know, it isn't that unintentional piece. But you're right. I think at first having a sort of that empathetic approach where we're all learning, we're all sort of understanding, our understandings to this situation perhaps are growing in different ways. And so, yes, I think at first I would take that empathetic approach, but at this point, perhaps I would have a different approach. But that's me personally. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it's 2 years have gone by, but I don't know what the interaction is a daily basis, once every 3 months. And actually on Sunday night, I went out with my best friend and her brother is transitioning to a she. And we played pool and I was really good about using her name, but it was so easy for me to say, get him. Like, because we were playing pool and it was competition. As soon as I said it, I realized it, but I could not stop myself from doing that. And I was thinking about if I'm only going to see her, you know, once every 3 months, I mean, how am I going to keep that locked in my brain? Because I've always known him as Jason and not as Jackie. And it's such a hard thing. But if it was on a daily basis, I was interacting with that person, then it would become commonplace and you would get used to it. But
So that relationship and sort of understanding what happened during those 2 years, I think, is important to this situation. Yeah, and I think every situation is always nuanced. And so, yeah, we can have a sort of response based on the information that we're given. But again, those sort of nuances, those sort of pieces, we don't exactly know. Okay. I believe I have 5 minutes. Is that correct, Cynthia? Okay. So this is sort of our toolkit to creating an inclusive workplace. And we talked about some of these, and some of these will be available in the slides for you to check out. But be welcoming, really a smile goes such a long way. Interrogate your biases, speak up using assertive communication, commit to continuous learning, model positive behavior. We all make mistakes, and so it's important that our apologies are meaningful and to practice allyship. And again, there were a number of videos that we sort of skimmed over, so I do encourage folks to definitely check those out. But I wanted to have a few minutes for us to think about and to commit to 2 things. So one is, what is one thing that you will commit to changing in your personal life after this presentation? And what is one thing you will commit to changing in your professional life after this presentation? So maybe think about it, write it down, commit to yourself and to each other. And if anyone would like to share, more than welcome. But also if you have any questions, any feedback on the presentation, I'm happy to take that now as well.
And I've asked online if anybody has any questions as well.
Perfect.
Be quite a lot online.
Okay.
Personally, my one thing I've noticed that I need to change is I'm so used to saying, thank you, ma'am, thank you, sir, that I need to get that out of my lexicon. Because I may not be identifying them as they want to be identified. It's just a conditioned response your parents taught you to be polite, but it may not work these days. And I don't know, do you have any suggestions on what other response I could use that might be less specific to a gender?
Yeah, so gendered language is always a tricky one. I like thank you folks, thank you everyone, thank you all.
What if you're speaking to an individual?
An individual. Just thank you, maybe? Yeah. I don't have one, I think. I never really thought about that one in particular, but I think I would just say thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.
No problem.
Thank you.
Anyone else would like to share their commitments?
Individually and professionally, I'm notorious for saying, hey, you guys, and I got to stop it. So I've been working on it.
Thank you for sharing. Like I said, these are personal commitments, and so hopefully you will reflect on them, you will commit to changing them. Again, there are a number of videos. I encourage you to check them out. I have my contact info here as well, so if you have any questions, yes.
So just following up on that, because actually it was funny because we had the same conversation during the first exercise, and somebody online just asked, what could you replace you guys with? Like, is there suggested language for replacing you guys?
Folks, perhaps?
Because it tends to be a maritime thing where we tend to know you guys. Yeah, so folks.
Yeah.
Y'all is what somebody put on the screen.
Y'all. Love that. Well, thank you all so much, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the forum.